And he said this was the flagship of the Confederacy. Every Tuesday, we gathered here under Senator Russell's direction to plan the demise of the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968. He said, this time, this table passes from the man who was against civil rights into the hands of a man who is for civil rights. Mr. President, let me begin by thanking the leaders for their kind comments. It is true that I have been here a long time, I say to my friend from Kentucky. As a matter of fact, as I prepared some remarks, and I say to my friend from Hawaii, I remember the first time I stood on the floor as a United States Senator. It was a desk directly to your left, Senator, the top row here, second in. It was temporarily my desk, and I remember standing up, having been told that the desk on my right was the desk of Henry Clays, and on my left, Daniel Webster, because the senior senator from the respective states got those desks. And I say to my friend from California, it was the only time I can remember being speechless, when I stood there as a 30-year-old kid thinking, oh, my God. I used to go over after every executive session of the United States Senate Judiciary Committee and go into Jim Vieslin's office, which was catty corner, and sit down. He'd allow me to ask him all the dumb questions a young kid would want to ask. Who was the most powerful man you ever met, Senator? What was the most significant thing that ever occurred since you've been here, et cetera? By the way, on that score, I asked him that, and he looked at me, he said, air conditioning. I said, I beg your pardon? He said, the most significant thing happened since I got here is air conditioning. I thought, wow, that's kind of strange. He said, well, he said, you know, Joe, he said, before we had air conditioning, he said, all those recessed lighting and all, they used to be great big pieces of glass, like in showers. He said, come around May, that sun, he used to use a little bit of profanity, which I will not use for appropriate reasons. He said, that darn sun would beat down on that dome, hit that glass, act like a magnifying glass, heat up a chamber, and we'd all go home in May or June for the year. He said, then we put in air conditioning, stayed year-round, and ruined America. During my first term in the Senate, when I spoke out in favor of campaign finance reform at a Democratic caucus, Senator Noe may remember this, he was then the Secretary of the Senate. The Senate pro tem, Jim Eastland, listened intently in what's now called the Mansfield room. And I got finished with this impassioned speech about the need for public financing. And Eastland stood up, and he hardly ever spoke at the caucus, as Senator Noe remember. He always wore a Glen plaid suit and always had a cigar in his mouth about as big as a rubber hose. And he leaned up on that. He never stood completely straight, and he was at the table in the front. He sought recognition. He leaned up, put himself halfway up, and took the cigar out of my mouth and said, Joe, they tell me you're the youngest man in the history of America ever to get elected to this august body. I wasn't. There was one younger than me, popularly elected, but I didn't dare correct him. He said, let me tell you something, Joe. Y'all make many more speeches like you did here today, you're going to be the youngest one-term senator in the history of the United States of America. I walked out of that conference, I said to Leader Reid, and walked in here. We didn't used to have those booths by the phone. And Warren Magnuson also smoked a cigar, pulled a cigar, and said, Biden, come here. Can you imagine calling a senator that, saying, come here. He said, stop this stuff. I didn't work this darn hard. Little language difference. I didn't work this darn hard for the last 30 years to have some sniveling little competitor get the same amount of money as me. Stop it. Stop it. I just walked away as politely and quickly as I could. I got here in '73, and one of the people, along with Danny and others on this floor, who kept me here, was Mike Mansfield, the majority leader. And he used to, once a week, have me report to his office, which was where the leader's office is on the other side. And he really was doing it, I know, in retrospect now, to take my pulse, see how I was doing. And I walked in one day through those doors on the Republican side, And a man who became my friend, Jesse Helms, and his wife Dot, who's still my close friend and I keep in contact with. I walked through those doors, and Jesse Helms, who came in '72 with me, was standing in the back excoriating Bob Dole for the Americans with Disability Act. And I walked through the floor on my way to my meeting with Senator Mansfield, and I walked in and sat down on the other side of his desk, and some of you remember he smoked a pipe a lot of times when he was in his office. And he had the pipe in his mouth. He looked at me and said, "Joe, it looks like something's bothering you." I said, "Mr. Leader," I said, "I can't believe what I just heard on the floor of the Senate. I can't believe anyone could be so heartless and care so little about people with disabilities. I tell you, it makes me angry, Mr. Leader." He said, "Joe, what would you say if I told you that 4 years ago, maybe 5, Dot Helms and Jesse Helms were reading, I think it's the Charlotte Observer, the local newspaper, and they saw an ad in the paper, or a piece in the paper, about a young man in braces who was handicapped at an orphanage, who was in his early teens. And all the caption said was the young man wanted nothing more for Christmas than to be part of a family. He said, what would you say if I told you Dot Helms and Jesse Helms adopted that young man as their own child? I'd say I'd feel like a fool, an absolute fool. He said, well, they did. He said, Joe, every man and woman sent here is sent here because their state recognizes something decent about them. It's easy to find the parts you don't like. I think your job, Joe, is to find out that part that caused them to be sent here. He said, Joe, never question another man's motive. Question his judgment, but never his motive. I think I can say without fear of contradiction, I've never questioned any one of your motive. I learned that lesson very, very early at the hands of Iron Mike Mansfield, who had more character in his little finger than the vast majority of people we know have in their own body, their whole bodies. In those days, chairmen dominated. Literally, as Senator Noe will remember, if a chairman said he wanted to vote, almost without exception, every other chairman voted with that chairman on the vote on the floor of the United States Senate in 1973. But the old ways of doing business and the old ways of thinking were at that very moment in the Senate's history beginning to change. As my colleagues know, there's a long-standing tradition in the United States Senate, I think honored in the breach now more than the rule. But when I got here in '73, it was mandatory that a new senator would pay respects to the, quote, old bulls of the Senate. I never dreamed I'd be an old bull of the Senate. But I remember the first appointment I made. It was to go see Senator John Stennis, chairman then of the Armed Service Committee. I now have Senator Stennis's office. And I walked in, and Senator Stennis had a great, large mahogany conference table that was a gift from the President of the Philippines to Vice President Barkley for the liberation of the Philippines. And he used it as his desk. There was he had a blotter at one end of it, and it seated, I don't know how many people it seats, 15 people, and it was his desk. And with a group of leather chairs around, and I walked in, and those who remember John Stennis said, talk that you like this when it talked, always put his hand up like this. And he looked at me, he said, young man, sit down, sit down. And he patted the leather chair next to him. So I dutifully sat down. And he said, congratulations. He said, may I ask you a question? I said, yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. He said, what made you run for the United States Senate? And being tactful as I always am, I answered honestly without thinking. I said, civil rights, sir. And as soon as I did, I could feel the beads of perspiration pop out of my head. And I thought, oh, my God. And he looked at me, he said, absolutely true story, he said, good, good, good. That was the end of the conversation. Well, that was 1973. In 1988, time had transpired. He'd become my good friend. We shared a hospital room, a hospital suite at Walter Reed for a number of months, and he had lost his leg to cancer. And it was during that interregnum period when President Bush was coming into office. And as the tradition is, as all of my colleagues know, you get to choose your officers based on seniority. As they come up, an office comes up. And I've always thought, we all think our officers are the finest, I always thought that his office, which had been the office of a man that he never referred to by his first name, Senator Owe, that I can remember, the man after whom the Russell Building is named, Chairman Russell. It had been his office. And so I walked down to look at his office. And it was that period in December when no one's around, the elections are over. And I walked in, and I think his secretary of 30-some years' name was Mabel. My memory is not certain on that, but I think her name was Mabel. And I walked in the ante office to hers, the ante room to her office, to his office. And all these boxes were piled up. He was packing up 40-some years of service. And she said, Senator, welcome, welcome. You're going to take my office. You're going to come and take our office. I said, well, I don't know. I think the name was Mabel. I said, I don't know, Mabel. I'm going to check. And she said, I said, is the chairman in? She said, no, you go right in the office. So I walked in the office. And without her knowing it, Senator Stennis had come in through the other door off the hallway and was sitting there in his wheelchair this time, in the same exact spot, with one leg, staring out the window of that office that looks out onto the Supreme Court. And I said, oh, Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I apologize for interrupting. He said, no, Joe. He said, come in. Sit down. Sit down. I sat down in that chair, and what astounded me, Senator Boxer, he looked at me, he said, Joe, do you remember the first time you came to see me? And I hadn't. He said, I asked you, and I've told my friend from Mississippi this story before as he walks to the floor about Senator Stennis. I asked him. He asked me, he said, do you remember? I said, no, I don't. And he said, I asked you why you ran for the Senate. And I said, oh, I remember. I was a smart young fellow, wasn't I? And he looked at me, he said, y'all going to take my office, aren't you, Joe? And he caressed that table, as Thad remembers, the table he loved so much. He caressed it like it was an adamant object. He said, you're going to take my office? And I said, yes, sir, I am. He said, well, I wanted to tell you then, in 1973, what I'm going to tell you now. He said, this table chair was the flagship of the Confederacy. If you read Masters of the Senate about Johnson's term, you'll see in the middle of the book a picture of the table in my office with the famous old Southern segregationist senators sitting around that table, chaired by Senator Russell. And he said this was the flagship of the Confederacy. Every Tuesday, we gathered here under Senator Russell's direction to plan the demise of the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968. He said, this time, this table passes from the man who was against civil rights into the hands of a man who is for civil rights. And I found it genuinely, without exaggeration, moving. We talked a few more minutes, and I got up and I got to the door, and he turned to me in that wheelchair, Thad, and he said, one more thing, Joe. He said, the civil rights movement did more to free the white man than the black man. I looked at him, I said, Mr. Chairman, how's that? And probably Thad will only remember as well as I do. He went like this. He said, it freed my soul. It freed my soul. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, I can tell you that by his own account, John Stennis was personally enlarged by his service in the Senate. That's the power of this institution.